Hello, and welcome to the September 11th meeting of the Analytical Psychology Club. First, a few announcements. Please remember your Zoom etiquette and always mute your microphone until you need to speak. Our next meeting will be on Sunday, October 9th, featuring Greg Bogart, who will present a talk entitled Ancient Myth and Current Passages, an exploration of our oldest known myths of initiation. On November 13th, the following month, we will host Nicole Pagano and her talk, The Dante Experience, Poetry as a Vehicle for Peace. And now let me move on to today's event and to introduce our speaker. When Stephen Herrmann was an undergraduate at UC Santa Cruz, he met a brilliant poet and former Dominican monk, William Everson, who taught a famous class called Birth of a Poet. When Stephen spoke to our club 2 years ago, he related how this experience and others unfolded throughout his life and in his talk entitled Vocational Dreams and Synchronistic Phenomenon. We are thrilled to have him back to speak about his new book, Swami Vivekananda and C.G. Jung, Yoga in the West. Swami Vivekananda first came to the United States in 1893, but his influence on Western religious, psychological, and philosophical thinking is still felt today. When Americans are listening to the better angels of our nature, we are capable of profound and influential philosophical and artistic movements. In his previous books, Stephen Herrmann has written about such notable members of this American intellectual tradition as William Everson, William James, Emily Dickinson, and Walt Whitman. When Swami Vivekananda came to visit America from his native India, he was able to have a deep conversation with our better angels. Stephen Herrmann is a Jungian analyst, practicing in Oakland, California, and an analyst member of the C.G. Jung Institute of San Francisco. He is the author of 7 books and over 40 papers and publications. Please give a warm welcome to Stephen Herrmann.
Thank you for that very wonderful introduction, Stephen. And it's a pleasure to be here speaking with all of you today on September 11th. As we all can feel and sense around us, the vibrations of 9/11 21 years ago are still with us. And when I was sitting down this morning to think about how I was going to start this talk, I started by going back to the talks that Swami Vivekananda gave just before his trip back to India in 1900 when he was here, particularly his talks on the Bhagavad Gita, and as well as what he called the science of breathing. And there it was very clear to me that there is a state of mind that he had been teaching and writing about when he was here in the United States that really was very much clarified in a book he wrote called Raja Yoga. This was 1896. And in that book, he speaks about prana being the breath, and also the universal vibrations. And what I read this morning, although I'd read it before, and I found one passage that I hadn't seen before in a meditation on the Bhagavad Gita, reminded me that there is a way to reverse the vibrations in the body, the soul, and the brain, through concentration and through the techniques of yoga, which he brought to the States. As Stephen was saying in 1893 at the Parliament of World Religions. And he talked in this discussion on the Bhagavad Gita about reversing the vibrations of fear and replacing it with fearlessness. And as you'll hear in my talk today, one of the things he repeated throughout his teachings is that if the Upanishads, the end of the Vedas, the great texts of India, the ancient scriptures, teach one thing, it's fearlessness. Okay? It may sound a little too heroic for some of you, and even for myself sometimes, but we have to remember that Vivekananda was a young man when he came to the United States. He was only 29 years old, and he was the star at the Parliament of World Religions. He was throughout all of the states on the front cover of the newspapers. He had talked to 7,000 people at the Parliament and was pretty much hailed as the shining star of the whole show. So I'm going to go ahead and start with my PowerPoint presentation right now, and then we'll get into let me redo this here. Looks like I have to exit that, go back in. You just take a minute here. Is that coming through now, Stephen?
Yes, it is.
Okay, great. Okay, so before Swami Vivekananda left his homeland in India at the age of 29, he had a powerful dream. He saw his master, Sri Ramakrishna, calling to him. His guru was summoning him to go in the dream to Chicago and deliver his message of non-dual Vedanta, that's Advaita Vedanta, to the Parliament of World Religions, which was to begin September 11th that year. The seminal speeches for which Vivekananda has become most well known in the West were given at the Parliament of World Religions in Chicago, beginning on September 11th, 1893. So on this day, I'm inviting you to celebrate with me the 129th anniversary of this historic event on September 11th, 2022. This will be a public presentation on publication of my new book, Swami Vivekananda and C.G. Jung, Yoga in the West. It's the front cover of my book. That's a picture, by the way, of our state mountain, Mount Shasta, with an elevation of approximately 14,000 feet. I will tell the story a little later about Swami Vivekananda's visit to Mount Shasta, but if you're wondering why Mount Shasta is on the front cover, it's because he spent 5 days there in a cabin with a Dr. Hiller, who was treating him at the time for his congenital foe, as he called it, diabetes. He was very sick. This is in May of 1900 when he was here. So that's the reason for the picture. He loved the mountains. He loved the Himalayas. And I think he really enjoyed his trip to Mount Shasta. This is a picture of Swami Vivekananda taken in 1900 in San Francisco, not far from our C.G. Jung Institute, which is now on Mission Street. He's looking upward, and he has on his traditional outfit as a monk. And this is after he came to America a second time and founded the Vedanta Center in San Francisco. So how did I get into studying Swami Vivekananda? I'm going to read to you a few passages from the opening prologue to my book, My Discovery of Swami Vivekananda and a Personal Experience. So while I was finishing my book, A Spiritual Democracy, in the spring of 2014, this is a book I published in 2014, so I was waiting for the final copy. I learned that Swami Vivekananda was quoted on the internet as being a teacher of spiritual democracy. This interested me since I had just written a book on the subject and wanted to understand what a Hindu monk might have to say about it when he was here in San Francisco in 1900. So shortly thereafter, I purchased the complete works of Swami Vivekananda in 9 volumes. This is volume 1. There's 9 of them. And these talks that he gave in the United States were recorded by his disciples who took down his speeches wherever he went. And fortunately, we have the collected works now of Vivekananda. So I went to the Vedanta Center Society in San Francisco, and I purchased these 9 volumes. And in addition, the 11 principal Upanishads that were translated into English by Swami Vivekananda's biographer, Swami Nikhilananda, who happens to have been the teacher of Joseph Campbell, and also was an editor of the Gospel according to Sri Ramakrishna, who was Vivekananda's master in Calcutta, India. So when I purchased the volumes, I just went with the flow. I just, with the rivers of consciousness, following his words, images, and ideas toward the wide open sea of the transpersonal psyche. Now, the word transpersonal was first coined here in the field of psychology by William James in 1906 in lecture notes for a talk he gave at Harvard. Carl Jung then later used the term in his 2 essays on analytical psychology, where he talked about the collective, or in parentheses, transpersonal unconscious. So when we're reading Vivekananda, we're really looking at levels of the psyche that are beyond the first 3 levels of what William James in his Principles of Psychology defined as the self with capital S. This is a book that Carl Jung read, and it influenced his dissertation in 1902. James distinguished between 4 levels of the self in 1890 in the Principles. The first level is the material level of the self, which includes the body self. The second level is the social level, the social self. And then the third level is the spiritual self. And then at the 4th level is what James defined as the metaphysical or transcendental self. So when we're reading Vivekananda, we're really going beyond the limits that were defined by William James and then later by Jung to talk about the limits of analytic psychology. William James called his psychology analytic. Later, Jung would use the term analytical psychology after Jung met James in 1909 and then again in 1910. I'm mentioning James here because William James actually met Swami Vivekananda on 3 separate occasions. After his talk at the Parliament of World Religions in 1894, James took Vivekananda out to lunch, and they had long talks about the practice of yoga, and Vivekananda demonstrated for James the technique of yoga on an experiential and pragmatic level. And then again in 1896, when Vivekananda lectured on ethics at Harvard University. So what I did was to begin by setting up a little practice with my wife, Lori, who's also a Jungian analyst. We created a little meditation space, and she used her Vipassana technique, mindfulness technique, to get her into touch with her own spiritual center. And I followed Vivekananda's instructions on how to create a yogic practice. And that included some learning that I did around deep breathing, or what he called pranayama, what's called pranayama in Vedanta. And I'll be speaking a little bit about the history of Vedanta as we proceed. But I'd first begun to write about Asian philosophy at the University of California at Santa Cruz in a course that I had taught by a practitioner of mindfulness meditation and Zen, and that was Jack Engler. And this is in 1979 and 1980, the same time I was serving as William Everson's teaching assistant at UC Santa Cruz. And I enrolled in a class on the campus that was taught by Ann Barrows, who happened to have studied with Iyengar, the great Iyengar yoga master. And she studied with him in India, and I had several classes with her in Iyengar yoga. So I was practicing yoga down there, and as a daily practice. And getting back in touch with yoga as a philosophy reminded me of my practice. So I also began to practice yoga again, which I had gotten out of touch with a bit. And I really started to feel some healing energies come back to me in a sense of inner peace. When I read Vivekananda's works, I arrived at a new level of understanding of yoga as a Western spiritual discipline, a path of sacred action. This is something I'd previously known since I had recited a few lines from the Upanishads and the Bhagavad Gita when I was in Santa Cruz, and I had done that for a couple of decades. And yet Vivekananda's works really awakened something in me that was new. And he transported me to new vistas of oneness. And this comes through again and again in his teaching, this idea of oneness through yoga, a state of mind and a state of being. And there was really an electrical force field that I sensed in his words, which had been devotedly preserved, as I said, by his students in the West. And what he had to say deeply resonated. He seemed to speak directly out of the superconscious or the higher self in a way that formed a complementary teaching to the works of C.G. Jung. A new way of uniting East and West without any unnecessary dualisms between psychology and religion, radical empiricism and transcendentalism. His teachings are non-dual, focused on finding unity, consciousness, strength, healing, and inner peace through yoga. Moreover, his public lectures, letters, and discourses in California are solace for anyone during a time of increasing climate change, as he gave his highest teachings, as he said, in San Francisco and Marin, where he meditated beneath some old growth redwood trees before returning to his homeland in India in the spring of 1900. He teaches us how to breathe deeply, how to find our grounding and centering and joy and responsibility to the self and the divine feminine during a time of devastating destruction to Mother Earth and superficial creeds and schools of religion. His yoga is a psychology of sacred work and a breath of fresh air. So, this is the book, Spiritual Democracy, that it was being published when I found Vivekananda's works. And I was very much interested in what he might have to say about democracy, which is not a lot, but I did find the passages I was looking for, and I will share those with you as we proceed. Now, this here is a picture of Sri Ramakrishna. Ramakrishna was one of the greatest yogis that India ever gave birth to. And he happened to have been the direct teacher of Swami Vivekananda. In fact, of the 16 disciples of Ramakrishna, Vivekananda was selected by Ramakrishna to be his chief and chosen disciple. As I mentioned, Vivekananda had a dream that his master came to him to come to Chicago to give his teachings. And Vivekananda, throughout all of his life, was extremely modest in his attitude as a disciple of the great master yogi, Ramakrishna. And he had spiritual experiences in the presence of Ramakrishna, where the whole teachings of yoga were transmitted to him through a touch. And I'll talk about that as we proceed. This is a picture of the swan as a symbol for liberation, freedom through yoga, that was created by Vivekananda. And it's now the logo, you could say, for the Ramakrishna math in Calcutta, which Carl Jung got to visit during his trip to India in 1936 and 37. He was there at the opening, Carl Jung, and got a tour through the Ramakrishna mission. And I think it's a beautiful picture. Now, I set up a little picture of Vivekananda on our little altar, and This was part of the meditation space that I created with Lori. And in the picture, we saw Ramakrishna, his eyes are open, but he's in a state of consciousness that is called in yogic literature samadhi. Samadhi is, for those of you familiar with Kundalini yoga, the experience of the highest chakra, illumined consciousness, chakra 7, the thousand-petaled lotus, and he's apparently in that state in the picture, but his eyes are faintly open.
The picture isn't. I'm sorry, the picture isn't shown. We're seeing words.
Right. This picture here is the picture of Ramakrishna, Shirley, if that was at you. And you can see his eyes are barely open. I'm going to show you in a moment the picture of Vivekananda with his eyes closed. But I was just making a point here. I just wanted you to see what's in the preface to my book. I've copied a paragraph here for you to give you a sense of how I made use of Vivekananda's teachings. So this suggested to me the closed eyes that you'll see in a minute of the picture of Vivekananda. I'll show you that. It suggested a personhood that was also vulnerable and soft, or what William James called tender-minded. Here's a quote by Vivekananda. He says, you cannot see your own face except in a mirror. And so the self, with capital S, cannot see its own nature until it is reflected. And this whole universe, therefore, is the self trying to realize itself. And this was captured in a complementary way by these two transcendental looks. Ramakrishna, as I just showed you, with eyes open, and Vivekananda with his eyes shut. Both are inward and outward focused, but in the first, the master's eyes are looking at the camera, whereas in the other, they're closed. And this is very interesting because it was Vivekananda who came to the West as a missionary of Vedanta, whereas Ramakrishna stayed in his ashram and the disciples came to him. So we have this kind of interesting reversal here. Here's the picture of Vivekananda in meditation. He was one of the deepest meditators probably that ever lived. From the stories I've read about him, he would get very deep into states of meditation and sometimes had to be brought out of those states because he went so deep. Okay, so who was Swami Vivekananda? Well, his name, Narendranath, or Narendra, as he was called, before he took the name Swami, Datta was his last name, was born in Calcutta in January 12th, 1863. So during our American Civil War. This is interesting because Vivekananda said of all the contests in the history of the world, the greatest contest ever was the American Civil War. And you'll see this again and again in Vivekananda's teachings, that he really had a very high respect for America. His mother had read the great Hindu epics, the Mahabharata, for example. His father was a distinguished attorney of the Calcutta High Court. Mr. Datta was an agnostic concerning religion. As a child, Narendra practiced meditation and showed great powers of inner concentration. He was by nature an introvert, but he lived an extroverted life as a world teacher, thus providing a paradigm for a person who lived out his destiny pattern in a complete way, or what the Jungian analyst from Tel Aviv, the Israeli analyst Eric Neumann, called central version, which is the ideal state of the individuated person. So let's go into a little more detail here about Vivekananda as a child. Well, I have a chapter on his biography. I've written a psychobiography of Vivekananda, and I have a chapter number 3, Dreams in Western Yoga. It was a great surprise to me to read, and a delight, how much Vivekananda focused on dreams, because sometimes in the teachings of yoga, one gets the sense that dreams were not of any great importance. What was most important was the high states of realization. Yet Vivekananda kept a very close record of his dreams, and I'll share a few of those as we proceed. This is a quote from his autobiography. From the earliest time I can remember, I used to see a marvelous point of light between my eyebrows as soon as I shut my eyes to go to sleep. And I used to watch its various changes with great attention. This marvelous point of light would change colors and get bigger until it took the form of a ball. Finally, it would burst and cover my body from head to foot with a white liquid light. As soon as that happened, I would lose outer consciousness and fall asleep. I used to believe that was the way everybody went to sleep. Then, when I grew older and began to practice meditation, that point of light would appear to me as soon as I closed my eyes, and I would concentrate upon that. So you see that even as a young child, Vivekananda was already having experiences of this high visionary function of the mind in the 6th chakra, the Ajna center, or the 3rd eye. He was really able to, he was a great visionary. And that's why I have a little section on him in my book, Spiritual Democracy. The wisdom of early American visionaries for the journey forward. Well, Vivekananda was one of those great American visionaries. So that's why my book subtitled Yoga in the West, because he really taught the West a form of Western yoga long before the arrival of Paramahansa Yogananda, who wrote the autobiography of the yogi. So Vivekananda was really the first great emissary of yoga to the West, and that's why I've celebrated him in my book. Now, here's another interesting experience that Vivekananda talks about of a vision that he had while meditating. In this vision, and this is from the age of approximately 16, Narendra, he was still Narendra then, beheld the striking figure of a monk in an ochre-colored cloth. The monk was holding a water pot in his hand and coming slowly towards him. The monk fixed his gaze upon Narendra as if he wanted to say something. Narendra was so seized with fear when he saw the monk approaching that he suddenly got up, quickly opened the door to his room, and stepped out. Reproaching himself for his cowardice, he returned to hear what the monk intended to say to him, but the monk had vanished. Why should I be afraid? Vivekananda asked. Narendra asked himself. He often thought later that the monk looked like Gautama Buddha. And the image of the Holy One's face, the face of compassion, was imprinted upon his heart and his mind forever. I think that's a lovely vision. And it's really what I consider to be a vocational type of a dream, as well as the one from childhood. These are dreams that come when the mind is really ready and open to have a perspective glimpse into one's future. Because as Vivekananda himself said about Buddha, Buddha was the great teacher of yoga or enlightenment to nirvana, to India, whereas I, Swami Vivekananda, am a Buddha to the West. So he saw himself as a Buddha who would bring the teachings of India to the Western world. See where we are here. Now, getting back to Vivekananda's experience of initiation, he had heard about Ramakrishna, and he was a very learned man. He had gone to the university and received his education, and then had a very deep desire, as you could see from the childhood experience and then the experience in late adolescence of the vision that came to him. He really was on a spiritual path, and he was trained in science and in Western education. So he really questioned anyone who put themselves out as a great teacher or guru. And so when he heard about Ramakrishna, he asked Ramakrishna, "Have you seen God?" And Ramakrishna said, "Well, yes, young man, I've seen God, and I've seen him just as I'm looking at you right now." So Vivekananda was still not convinced that Ramakrishna was a living incarnation of the gods Rama and Krishna, from whom he took his name. And, by the way, an incarnation of the goddess Kali, who he identified with as well. Ramakrishna cross-dressed, wore women's clothing because he was raised by women. And so you see this kind of androgyny in Ramakrishna. Well, Vivekananda saw that in Ramakrishna as well, but still was not convinced that he was the incarnation of the god and the goddess. And so he continued to question him. Well, eventually he met his beloved master in November of 1881. Now, in 1881, Carl Jung was 6 years old. So that puts things in perspective here. When he was 18, Ramakrishna immediately took Narendra under his wing and initiated him into the highest spiritual realizations. At first, Narendra doubted Ramakrishna could assuage his religious doubts about God's existence. "Have you seen God?" he had asked. But after his master touched him, he miraculously went into samadhi. His mind underwent a complete transformation, and he was shocked to see that there really is nothing whatsoever in the whole universe but God. I have a picture of a spiral galaxy there. So now let's fast forward from his time in Calcutta, under the teachings of his master, which I speak about in my book. But we want to get to September 11th. So here is Swami Vivekananda, the 29-year-old monk from India, who's waiting his speech next to other members of the parliament. And just to give you a little flavor of what he had to say in his speech, and this is just the opening lines. Now, before I give you those lines, I want to let you know that what Swami Vivekananda did was rather historic in the history of American spirituality and religion. He took a bow before the goddess Sarasvati, the goddess of wisdom. So he was, in a sense, honoring the goddess in a predominantly Christian atmosphere. Of course, there are other Sufis and other people from different parts of the world, India, but the goddess worship was very central to the history of India. And here's his speech, his opening words. Sisters and brothers of America, it fills my heart with joy unspeakable to rise in response to the warm and cordial welcome which you have given us. I thank you in the name of the most ancient order of monks in the world. I thank you in the name of the mother of religions. And I thank you in the name of millions and millions of Hindu people of all classes and sects. I am proud to belong to a religion which has taught the world both tolerance and universal acceptance. We believe not only in universal toleration, but we accept all religions as true. So this really shows his spiritually democratic attitude that he brought with him from India to the West. Now, after his great success, as I mentioned, he did meet William James on 3 occasions. And this is what the Swami had to say about William James when Miss Bull, who he was staying with, she invited him to stay at her house, asked him, well, how did you like Mr. James, Swami? And he said, a very nice man, a very nice man. So they apparently got along quite well together. James was very interested in Vivekananda's teachings, and he read the 1896 book, Raja Yoga, and it became one of the core texts that James used in his masterpiece, The Varieties of Religious Experience, published in 1902, which influenced Jung. So let's go back and get a little background on Advaita Vedanta, the school out of which Ramakrishna and Vivekananda emerged, as well as the great teacher of integral yoga, who was the inspiration for the California Institute of Integral Studies here in San Francisco. And that was Sri Aurobindo. Sri Aurobindo read Vivekananda's works, just as Mahatma Gandhi did, and was strongly influenced by Vivekananda. But the school, CIIS, which was the first school of transpersonal psychology here in the Bay Area, was really founded by the integral theory, integral psychology that emerged out of Sri Aurobindo's integral yoga, which was inspired by Swami Vivekananda. So let's go back now in time to the origins of Advaita Vedanta. This is 700 to 750 CE, approximately, that the great synthesizer of the Vedas, the Upanishads, and the Bhagavad Gita, Sri Sankaracharya lived. And this is the school out of which Advaita Vedanta emerged. He was the founding father, you could say, of Advaita Vedanta as one of three forms of Vedanta. So unlike the early American visionaries of spiritual democracy, Vivekananda's vocation to teach universal equality to all was Vedic at its religious roots. And his national psychology undoubtedly helped shape him and his ideas from his earliest boyhood. He gave us the real thing, classical yoga and Advaita Vedanta at its best. Advaita Vedanta was defined by Swami Vivekananda, Vivekananda's biographer, as non-duality, a school of Vedanta philosophy teaching the oneness of God, soul, and universe, whose chief exponent was Sankaracharya, or Shankara, as he's often called in the West. This is a picture of Nataraja, the dancing Shiva, with a copy of Volume 1 of Vivekananda's works beneath it. I took that picture for the announcement. This is a wonderful bronze statue that I found in a bookshop in Berkeley in the late 1990s, and purchased it from a woman there who was willing to let it go, and I'm very glad she did. So the non-dual self in Advaita Vedanta, how the concept of the self in William James's writings and in C.G. Jung's writings can be compared with the concept of the self in Vedanta. What is important to grasp as I proceed are the following sentences from Sankaracharya's commentaries on the Upanishads. Outside the knowledge of the non-dual self, the complete attainment of the highest good is impossible. Free from the fetters of birth, they, yogis, attain the state that is beyond all evil. Knowing it, turiya, which is a name for the fourth state of mind, one is not touched by evil action. So let me just say something about turiya. Turiya is the state of complete self-realization, or samadhi, in its various forms. Ramakrishna said there are 5 states of samadhi, and I won't get into those specifics, but in the Upanishads, in the Mandukya Upanishad, it's stated the life of man or women is divided between waking, dreaming, and dreamless sleep. But transcending these 3 conscious states is superconscious vision, called the fourth. Beyond the senses, beyond the understanding, beyond all expression is the fourth, turiya. It is pure unitary consciousness in which all awareness of the world and of its multiplicity are completely obliterated. It is ineffable peace. And you know, the Upanishads, they always end with peace. Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. So what is yoga? Well, according to the first principle in Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, the definition of yoga practically and simply is yoga consists of the intentional stopping of the spontaneous activity of the mind stuff. So the aims of yoga, you could say, differ from Vipassana meditation, where the aim is to observe the mind, but not to try to control the mind or stop the mind, but to watch the chitta, what is going on in the mind, and to be observant of that activity and to watch one's breath. Whereas the definition in the Yoga Sutras was that the yogi can intentionally stop that activity, and we might say distractibility of the mind. You know, we talk so much in the field of psychology and psychotherapy and analysis of ADD, distraction, the distracted mind. Today is like September 11th, I didn't look at the newspapers this morning or the news, but I know that everywhere right now, and of course, we are in national mourning, but, as I pointed out when we started, the idea for today was to see if we could reverse those vibrations, the vibrations of fear, because who didn't feel fear and terror on September 11th when we saw those pictures? Fear is what went through us first before we had a day of national mourning. So to reverse those vibrations is to try and create a state of mind in which harmony, oneness, unity, and peace can exist. So one of the things I explore in my book is the hypothesis of the superconscious or the higher self. Now this has a long history in India going all the way back to the ancient Vedas. In a letter to Mr. E.T. Sturdy, sent from New York in 1895, Vivekananda created a new hypothesis for modern psychology to consider, alongside the notion of the subconscious, the conscious, and the unconscious. James, by the way, used the term subconscious, whereas Carl Jung, following Freud, used the term unconscious. Vivekananda distinguished between the subconscious, the conscious, and the superconscious. Okay. So Vivekananda and E.T. Sturdy, who was a follower of Vivekananda, were discussing this idea. And back in Zurich, later, Carl Jung ended up in dialogue with Heinrich Zimmer and other Indial studies of Indian yoga. And interestingly, one of the individuals who was being discussed at the time, and he was still alive, was Mr. E.T. Sturdy. And what Jung was being asked was, well, is there a superconscious in your concept of the collective unconscious? And Carl Jung was considering it, and was after his trip to India that Jung really included the concept of a superconscious in the unconscious. And this wouldn't really be made crystal clear and explicit until 1948, when he wrote On the Nature of the Psyche and coined the term psychoid. The psychoid level of the unconscious is the level at which one taps into the universal mind, or one could say the superconscious dimensions of the self. Although it's not discussed much in analytical psychology today when we talk about analysis. However, after his trip to India, and again, Jung went to India in 1936 for the Crystal Jubilee, and Freud went along, and Jung got a dysentery and up in the foothills of the Himalayas and spent 5 days in a hospital where he had visions, by the way, of blood, red. He saw red, and it was after he had been to the Kali temple and saw blood splattered against the walls that Jung was seeing this in his delirious state. Anyway, fast forward, he got back to Zurich in 37, and in 1939 wrote this psychological commentary for Walter Evans Vence's translation of the Tibetan Book of the Dead. And in a letter of that same year, Jung admitted, "I quite agree with Mr. Sturdy," again, this was Vivekananda's disciple now, "his standpoint that there are states of intensified consciousness that deserve the name superconsciousness." So this is an important notion to consider psychologically, as it shows that Jung did not leave the higher self out of his empirical considerations. But who was Mr. Sturdy? As I said, he was a devout disciple of Vivekananda and one of the chief supporters of Vivekananda in England. All right, so let's go back and learn something more about Vivekananda. After his tour, first tour to America, he was traveling in 1896. He visited Jung's home base in Switzerland. Jung was 21 years old and a student at the University of Basel. He'd been traveling with some companions through the Swiss Alps. They hiked up the glacier, Monte Rosa, and everything he had seen, imagined, or dreamt, Vivekananda said, he was now perceiving in space in the high Swiss Alps in a conscious state. He was in a state of conscious dreaming. Vivekananda wrote back home to a friend, "In our dreams, our souls read a layer of our mind which we do not read in our waking hours. And however unsubstantial imagination may be, it is behind the imagination that all unknown psychic truths lie." So, I've introduced a lot of concepts here. I want to give you some more impressions of who this man was. And I also want to say just a few words as I'm proceeding here about Jung and his voluminous writings on yoga and Buddhism. We now have the ETH or ETH lectures that were given in 1939 by Jung. It's a marvelous book. It was just published last year while I was waiting for this book to come out. And Jung said that the exercises of Saint Ignatius of Loyola were the only official medieval form of yoga in the West. And alchemy was for Jung the unofficial form of Western yoga. So there was a discrepancy in the ways that William James and C.G. Jung viewed the efficacy of the Ignatian method, for one, compared with the techniques of Eastern yoga. For James, the slant on the side of a scientifically corroborated evidence was in favor of yoga. It's very interesting because Jung did not recommend Hatha yoga, which is the asanas that we find in our yoga studios everywhere throughout the States now. He did not give much credence to yoga as a physical practice. He did not see that many benefits from yoga. In fact, warned against the dangers of yoga. Jung said we need to understand yoga with our head as Westerners. Now, if anybody taught yoga from a very high intellectual level to the West, it was Vivekananda. Jung apparently didn't, he had a biography on Vivekananda, intellectual biography, which I read on his bookshelf. But in his lectures on the psychology of yoga and Eastern meditation, Jung only mentioned Vivekananda, I think, in 2 places. And in one place, he criticized Vivekananda for his shameless advertising of yoga. And was aware that there were 3 Vedanta centers already, one in New York, one in LA, and one in San Francisco in 1939 when he was giving his lectures. But from my overview, which I have written out in chapter 5 of my book, William James and C.G. Jung and Vivekananda, I talk about the differences and similarities on James's and Jung's views towards yoga. And I know that Jung's criticisms of yoga are very valuable because of the dangers that can happen through identification. You know, Jung was constantly warning about the dangers of identifying with an archetype of the self. And of course, in India, one says, I am Shiva, I am Brahma, I am Buddha consciousness, you see. And I think Jung saw the dangers of that. And he even makes some rather humorous statements about the fellow who says he is the Buddha in the West would be carted off to the Berg Holtzley, or one would cart oneself off to the Berg Holtzley if one thought one was the Buddha. So you see, Jung was always concerned about this problem of identity. And so he had extremely important things to say to the West, Jung, about yoga and Buddhism. And yet William James saw the health benefits of yoga. He had a personal friendship with a follower of Vivekananda who had terrible cyclothymic disorder, where he got into states of mania and then depression, couldn't get out of bed for 5 days, and was dealing with a lot of anxiety. And so he tried all the Western medicine and recommendations. He took a trip through Europe to try to get some health benefits from Western medicine and couldn't find any treatment that worked for him. Of course, we didn't have analysis back then when James was alive yet. I mean, psychoanalysis had just emerged in 1898 with Royer and Freud's studies on hysteria. So here was James interested in Hatha yoga and breathing and how it could help health with the health of individuals. Because, you know, James really wanted to understand healthy-mindedness. That was one of his chapters in the Varieties of Religious Experience. So I have a lot in the book about the similarities and differences between James and Jung on yoga. And then I wanted to share with you this very interesting dream, which I see in my book, chapter 13. I call it Vivekananda's Dream of the Ancient Rishi and the Quest for Spiritual Democracy. Vivekananda says this: I had a curious dream on my return voyage from England. He said during discussion with a disciple in January of 1898, while our ship was passing through the Mediterranean Sea, in my sleep, a very old and venerable looking person, Rishi-like, in appearance, stood before me and said, "Do ye come to effect our restoration? Do ye come to effect our restoration?" Now, I want to pause for a minute and define what a Rishi is. A Rishi is a poet, an ancient chanter of the Vedas. These are the seers of the Vedas who saw certain lines, verses of the Vedas, and then they recited them. So a Rishi is really a seer, okay? So this ancient seer comes to Vivekananda and asks, "Are you coming to effect our restoration?" He said, "I am one of that ancient order of therapeutae, which had its origins in the teachings of the Indian rishis. The truth and ideals preached by us have been given out by Christians and taught by Jesus. But for that matter, there was no such personality in the name of Jesus ever born." He goes on, and in this vision, and Vivekananda is now traveling through the vicinity of Turkey, and Vivekananda wakes up, you could say, from his dream vision. He asks the ship captain, "Where were we just now?" And the captain says, "Well, we were just passing by Turkey." And Vivekananda rushed to the upper deck and said to the captain, "What neighborhood is the ship in just now?" "Look yonder," the captain said. "There is Turkey and the land of Crete." So I speak about this very interesting dream vision in the book as an example of the ancient Rishi that came to Vivekananda to give him his mission or his calling. In the hagiographies of Ramakrishna, it's often said that Vivekananda was basically the disciple of Ramakrishna, but I see Vivekananda as his own man, he was the emissary of Vedanta to the West. Yes, he was clearly inspired by Ramakrishna, but as I mentioned in the talk before, Ramakrishna came to him in a dream. So you see how the unconscious or the superconscious, is the way Vivekananda would view it, was leading him to his destiny. This is one of those classic destiny dreams that I have been speaking about in other works. My work on William Everson, where I studied vocational dreams at UC Santa Cruz, and also in my book on William James and Carl Jung. I mentioned the book Raja Yoga, which I'm not going to go into very much detail about here, since I'm not really teaching yoga. I'm trying to stay focused on the goal that I saw this morning, which was to try and keep us focused on a certain vibration today. And that's the vibrations of this man, Vivekananda, that people felt when they were around him. The calling to restore the teachings of the ancient rishis of India came not from Ramakrishna, I hypothesize, but from the archetype of the rishi within him, the ancient seer or sage. This was an archetypal dream of an ancient seer with tremendous significance for an understanding of how his teachings on character development came into being from the deepest transpersonal layers of the Vedic psyche. This archetype of the rishi could be as old as the Rig Veda itself, which means it could go back into layers of the Indian psyche 4,000 years old, 2 millennia before Christ. Restoration is an act of restoring something to its original state. Restoring India was one of Vivekananda's seminal ideas around which everything turned like a prayer wheel. His dream. His dream was to awaken India, to awaken the West to her true destiny of spiritual democracy. And we'll get to his comments on democracy shortly. In a letter written in the summer of 1899, sent to the States from Paris, William James had this to say about Vivekananda's stupendous speeches. I've been reading some of Vivekananda's addresses in England, which I had not seen. That man is simply a wonder for oratorical power. As for the doctrine of the One, I began to have some talk with that most interesting Miss Noble, Vivekananda's Western disciple, Margaret Noble, about it, but it was cut short, and I confess that my difficulties have never been cleared up. But the Swami is an honor to humanity in any case. See, Vivekananda really had a personal influence on James. And you could say on American psychology, as I was talking with Steve at the beginning of our meeting today, how much American culture has been influenced by this man who some people don't know much about at all. So I say in my book that James's overall view on yoga was more positive than Jung's when it came to the breathing and physical practices of Hatha yoga and the entrance of the mind into samadhi. Now, in my book on William James and C.G. Jung, Doorways to the Self, I have chapter 25, C.G. Jung's views on yoga. And then in chapter 32, Kundalini yoga and analytical psychology. So I had done some research previously in my earlier book on Jung's seminars on Kundalini yoga, which are fabulous. Jung basically states that for the Western person, one doesn't go any further than, this is where analytical psychology stops, at the level of the throat, Visuddha. Whereas ajna, the third eye and the thousand-petal lotus, he says these are states of realization for perhaps 2,000 years in the future. But James was very interested in the superconscious, as Jung later was, with a little bit more guardedness, one could say. And James made, as far as I can tell, no negative value judgments toward Westerners adopting yoga or Buddhism as a spiritual practice. He spoke in the most positive terms about what he'd observed in Western people who'd adopted also as their religion, such as Margaret Noble. So as I mentioned, Jung, between 1938 and 40, November, delivered these lectures at the ETH in Zurich on the psychology of yoga and meditation. And he started off with the psychological technique of active imagination. You see, this is what Jung was most interested in, was in dreams and active imagination. And then he delved deeply into the study of some parallels found in Eastern meditative practices. Very fascinating book when it comes to understanding the symbolism and imagery, as well as the philosophy. Jung was a marvelous teacher of yogic philosophy and Buddhist philosophy. And as he said, we need to start with an intellectual understanding of yoga. So understanding these lectures is crucial for anyone who wishes to know what Jung really had to say about Western yoga. Here are 4 key concepts that Jung introduced in his volume, actually his lectures that are now a volume. And the first is meditatio, to consider or to ponder. When one is focusing on an image, one focuses on the image until it begins to change. And then something happens. And this is what Vivekananda calls concentration. The second stage of the technique is impregnation of the background, that the concentration itself impregnates the image so that it begins to animate. The image begins to move, and then you see some of the imagery that we have in the Red Book now of all these marvelous transformations that Jung went through his method. And the fourth stage is fructification of the symbol through attention. Something begins to fructify. You see this in his dialogues with Izdubar, the figure of Gilgamesh in the Red Book, where Jung gives birth to, he becomes a mother of God, Jung, echoing Meister Eckhart. And in that process, he's really giving birth to his analytical psychology. Now, this is a picture I painted when I was practicing Kundalini yoga as a very young, well, I was 20, I was a young man. And I had found this marvelous book by Joseph Campbell, The Mythic Image. And in that book, I found the chapter on yoga in the West. And there's that wonderful picture of Ramakrishna. I had no idea who Swami Vivekananda was at that time, but I painted this watercolor of the Kundalini serpent and the energies of the psyche moving up through the chakras to higher levels of consciousness. And actually, I did have an experience through this practice, which I later gave up when I went to Santa Cruz. And it was an experience that was life-changing, and I've never had another experience like it in my life. So I just thought I'd show you this picture to illustrate what Jung called a fructification of the symbol through attention. You know, it's the fire, Agni, rising from the third chakra up through the spinal center to the higher levels of consciousness. And I used to meditate on that picture as a way to practice. And it was all self-taught. I basically didn't have a teacher. So anyway, let's move on now. Jung also mentioned that the followers of the Ramakrishna order temples in the United States, San Francisco, he mentioned, close to our Jung Institute here. And in a lecture, he discussed pranayama, this technique of breathing, where Jung said there are many people among us who cannot really breathe. If one could breathe better overall, one would not see so many people with breathing difficulties. Positive statement. I like that. And now let's move ahead here to, or back in time now to March 28th, 1900. This is the class that Vivekananda gave in San Francisco called The Science of Breathing. He pointed out the practical benefits of pranayama. The first benefit is health. 99% of us do not breathe properly, he said. This is a different, Jung said many of us, and Vivekananda said 99% of us. So you could see a man coming from the East observe things a little differently. We do not inflate the lungs enough, he said. Regularity of breath will purify the body. It quiets the mind. When you are peaceful, your breath is going on peacefully. It is rhythmic. If the breath is rhythmic, you must be peaceful. When the mind is disturbed, the breath is broken. And I'm sure all of us know that experience when we're under stress and our breathing starts to get shallow and rapid, and anxiety starts to increase, and before we know it, the the sympathetic nervous system is switched on, and it's hard to quiet the mind in those physical states. So how do you get the parasympathetic nervous system under control? Well, the teachings of ancient yoga is that one starts with the breath. When you are disturbed, go into the room and close the door. So this is Vivekananda's prescription about what to do. You know, you don't rush out to see the psychotherapist. You go into your room and you shut the door. Do not try and control the mind, but go on with rhythmic breathing for 10 minutes. The heart will become peaceful. And this is actually physiologically proven. These are common sense benefits that come to everyone. So this is very practical wisdom. And we all know something about this from our studies of Buddhism or yoga. And if one's taken a yoga class, of course, that's part of the practice. Usually not as much as the asanas. Now, this is a picture of the Belluar motte. This is the new structure that Jung went in 1936 and 37. It was in January of 37 that Carl Jung got a tour when it had just opened. And that's where he visited shortly before he became ill with his virus. Now, in the Kundalini seminars, Jung had taken a special interest in the lower chakras, particularly the lowest, Muladhara, which is at the base of the spine, and in which the highest spiritualization of psychophysical energy is constellated, and it emerges into consciousness through an organic process out of the base of our physiological organism. And a yogi or yogini may thereby be enabled to, through tapas, to achieve elephant strength. Jung actually says this in his Etihal lectures. He uses that term. And there's a symbol for this in India that's well known throughout the world today for the transpersonal self embodied in the figure of Ganapati, Ganesha, or simply Ganesh, the Hindu god with an elephant's head, which I love. I have 4 different statues of Ganesh. There's 3 of them. And Lori bought me that last one, the quartz crystal Ganesh, when we were up in Mount Shasta visiting. And here is a description in the appendix to the book Raja Yoga, where Vivekananda gives us a wonderful description of what comes after the practice of the physical postures, the asanas that we perform in yoga studios, Trikonasana, or standing in the tree pose, or the lotus posture. Translated from Shankara's commentaries on the Shvetashvatara Upanishad. What comes after the yogi has mastered the asanas of Hatha Yoga is the practice of pranayama that begins with the worship of Ganapati. So I've meditated on the figure of Ganesh many times and feel a real affinity with Ganesh, which is beyond words. In notes on the proof of religion, because Vivekananda was very interested in proofs, again, you know, having met William James, who was father of radical empiricism, and played such a prominent role in influencing Jung's empirical psychology, Vivekananda had this to say about yoga. Breathing trains the body, gets it into a harmonious condition. The object of the breathing exercises is to attain meditation and concentration. This is beautifully stated. It has a ring of truth to it that might also be of interest to psychologists. I particularly love what the Swami said about breathing. His teachings about pranayama, control of the breath, one of the techniques of Western yoga, has been a personal boon to me. This focus on breath is found in most forms of Eastern meditation and many Western forms as well. It appeared first in the Vedas, so there must be a universal truth to its efficacy as a psychological technique for stilling the mind. And again, I think physiologically, the explanation of the activation of the parasympathetic nervous system probably speaks most directly to this, which is where we get into that deep theta state. The life of man is divided between waking, dreaming, and then dreamless sleep. You see, the yogi can get into those deep states through meditation and yoga. In chapter 18 of my book, I cite Vivekananda's simple instructions on pranayama from a class given in Northern California, March 26, 1900, to the Vedanta Society of San Francisco. And this is what he says. The first point is the position. Sit with the spine perfectly free, with the weight resting on the hips. The next step is breathing. Breathe in the left nostril and out the right. Fill the lungs full and eject all the breath. Clear the lungs of all impure air. Breathe full and deep. The next thing is to think of the body as luminous, filled with light. There's again his childhood dream of the light. The next thing is to concentrate on the base of the spine, not from the outside, but look down the spinal column inside the base of the spine. This is basically a Kundalini exercises. Now, when the Beatles traveled to India, the conversations between George Harrison and Ravi Shankar, who introduced Harrison to the teachings of Vivekananda, led to the writings of the beautiful song, My Sweet Lord, which rose to #1 on the music charts. This popular hit and the introduction of classical sitar music by Shankar and now his daughter Anushka Shankar helped transmit Indian spirituality directly to America and the world at large. This was during the 60s, the heyday of the transpersonal movement in the Bay Area, and I already explained how Vivekananda's influence was there at the founding of the California School of Integral Psychology as well. So while I was in the midst of writing an early draft of 3 chapters, several chapters of the book in March of 2015, I decided to drive up to Mount Shasta to camp on the sacred mountain for a couple of days and allow myself to feel deeply into the atmosphere where Vivekananda had once breathed and sought out healing. Since I've never been to India and the Himalayas, this was as close an experience of elevation as I could get as a Californian. Shasta City is about a 4-hour drive from our home in Oakland. When I arrived at the base camp at an elevation of about 7,000 feet, I was in a bit of an altered state. As I'd been listening to Ravi Shankar and doing some pranayama during some breaks on Highway 5, those breaks you can take, and doing some pranayama. And I had a wonderful experience up there. I went by myself and took a little tent, and I camped on the sacred mountain. And then I was going to drive to Black Butte and climb Black Butte, which is a cinder cone which erupted around 8000 BC. It's recorded by the Native Americans of the Mount Shasta area that they witnessed it. But the road was closed because of some rains. We could sure use some of those this year. And I decided to go to Castle Lake instead. And I was wanting to get in touch with that feeling of what it must have been like for Vivekananda to go up there and seek healing. I had a little bit of eczema on my leg, and I was wanting healing myself from the eczema. So I went up there and thought I'd get myself in touch with some good harmonic vibrations. And I climbed up to this lookout here and I was going to Heart Lake, which I had been before with Lori, and on the way up, two women from southern India approached me and said, do you happen to know, sir, where Heart Lake is? I said, well, I'm going there myself right now, and would you like to come along with me? And I'll show you the way. And they were very delighted because they had been lost for a half hour looking for the trail. And I knew the way, so I guided them up there. I was their guide. And on the way up, we had a marvelous talk about Swami Vivekananda. And they told me how their father and grandfather had been followers, disciples of Vivekananda, and how the grandfather had put up a little altar and with pictures of Ramakrishna and Vivekananda and the Divine Mother, Ramakrishna's wife, and how every Indian house had a little meditation corner like this. And, we were talking about pranayama. They told me they don't practice it anymore, but they did when they were girls, teenagers, and everybody knew about Vivekananda because he'd returned a national hero to India and was celebrated very widely there for his great triumph in Chicago, and he was hailed as a national hero. So Vivekananda was very well represented in the household of these two young women. And we were sitting up on the granite, looking out at Mount Shasta with that beautiful view of the mountain. And they wanted to share some of their food with me, and we had further talk. They asked me about who I was, and I told them I had just written a book on spiritual democracy, and they were very interested in that. And the reason is because Vivekananda, when he was here in 1900 in the spring, gave a very important talk called "Is Vedanta the Future Religion?" And in that talk, he had stated that America had a chance, because of its democracy, to be the place where Vedanta would really spread. And so he really loved California. And these young girls were very interested in the concept of spiritual democracy, which is also very much a part of Indian life and culture and civilization. But the term itself was coined by Walt Whitman, as I point out in my book on Walt Whitman. And he coined that term, actually used the term religious democracy. And I prefer the term spiritual democracy because it's more contemporary. Vivekananda didn't use the term himself, but he did say that, democracy really had a chance of becoming he was interested in world religion and uniting the world religions. You see, this is why he was so prominent at Chicago. So anyway, the end of the story about our talk is that one of them was a scientist, and one of them happened to be a specialist in skin disorders, by the way. So when I told her I had gone up there because I had a little eczema on my leg and I was looking for some healing, she was very interested and asked me if I'd tried any Western medicines, and I told her no. And she was very interested in Western medicine. But we listened to the sound of the frogs. There were hundreds of frogs in this little creek that was feeding into Heart Lake, and they began to sing. And it was, before we knew it, it was a symphony of sound. And we just listened in silence together and meditated on the sound of the frogs. And I could feel the prana of the whole universe around us. It was a sense that we were all in this state of satori, or, an awakened mind suddenly, that the three of us, and looking out at Mount Shasta and thinking about how Swami Vivekananda had been there to try and heal his diabetes. Well, here's a picture of my son, Emmanuel. He's 40 this year. He's the founding manager of MoveOn.org, so I'm very proud of him. And there is Mount Shasta in the background. I thought I'd just throw that in there to end with a happy note. And I'm going to now, if I can do this, Stephen, exit this. See, stop share. Here we go. All right. So, am I back now, Stephen?
Yes, you are.
Okay. So that's my overview. I have more to say, but I want to open this up to either we can take a short break now, Stephen, since it's so long. Well, what would you like to do? You guide us.
Well, maybe we should take a short break and then come back. And I assume you want to entertain questions and answers.
Yeah, I'd be very happy to. And I'm looking forward to the rest of the afternoon.
Why do you think Jung had difficulty with Hatha yoga?
Jung actually documents his concerns about several of the people around him who he was concerned about. Look, we know this about Jung, that when he was composing his Red Book, he was under states of great stress, and he had broken off from Sigmund Freud, and he plunged into the unconscious and did this experiment with his active imagination. Well, during that time, he says in his autobiography that he relied on techniques of yoga to help him get himself into a state of mind where he could be calm enough to practice active imagination. So it's not that Jung didn't ever practice physical forms of yoga. He actually tells us that he did. But it's interesting that in his teachings on yoga, he cautioned Westerners not to practice it. Because he was concerned, what I've put together are two things. The number one concern for the Western person, according to Jung, is the problems of ego inflation that comes from identity with the self. That's, for Jung, he worked at the Berg Holtzley, so he saw too many cases there of schizophrenia where someone identified with a royal person and became psychotic. So, we have to understand the origins out of which Jung's psychology came into birth. And one of them was a psychiatric practice. It can't be denied that Jung had some Western biases towards Western spiritual practices. Anyone who reads his new book, the new book on the yoga and Eastern meditation. Now, we don't have the Eteha lectures yet on the exercises of Ignatius of Loyola, the Christian spiritual practices, which Jung said is the only official form of yoga in the West. I'm really looking forward to the publication of that book because it's going to give us more information. We don't have all of Jung's wisdom yet. We don't yet understand, I think, the full picture of why he was so cautionary about the physical forms of yoga. Part of it, I think, was Jung's hypothesis, and this was only a hypothesis. I don't know that it's confirmed by objective validity studies, that the Western psyche is created differently, and one has to remain rooted in one's tradition. You see, this was part of Jung's, as a Swiss son of Zwinglian Protestant religion. You know, he had 9 uncles who were parsons, and his father was a parson. So he came out of a very strong family of Christian theologians. And so Jung's psychology was not psychology, not theology. Okay, he really drew a line between metaphysics and empirical depth psychology. So I think he was concerned about the spread of yoga in Europe at the time. It was really beginning to catch fire. And one thing I put together is that James's intuition was extroverted, Jung's was introverted. I think James could see further into what was coming in the American future. And we see that in some of his late essays, particularly this one essay, The Energies of Men, where he talks about getting into a third or a fourth wind. James, I have a whole chapter in here on James's radical empiricism and how much breathing was a part of that. He talks about the breathing self, and he was very interested in breathing techniques. Jung was more interested in the imagination. He was more interested in dreams and symbols and mythology.
Well, maybe he was just more also projecting his religious background onto what his spiritual thing was. I think, I personally think he couldn't handle the Eastern spirituality the way that maybe James did, or certainly the Eastern spiritual. You know, his lack of understanding, I think, in danger and I am God. I mean, for me, is questionable about his inability to surrender. And
I see, Mallory. Yeah.
Yeah, and you know, like when you're dealing with somebody like Mayor Baba's teaching, and the mosques, the people who we would call psychotic, they would call highly spiritual, and in line with a very strong connection to what Eastern people see as God. And I just think, I think because his lack of surrender got in his way. More than not. And that's why I think he has this fear base of both being in the body and connecting, and the fear base of surrendering to God.
That's very clear. Thank you, Mallory, for those comments. I think that rings true with some of the things I've put together as well. And it also raises the question for me, having written a book on William James and Jung, about whether the American psyche is constructed differently than the European psyche, and whether Jung was really picking up on something. We can't speak for Jung, but he later changed his position when he began getting letters from Indian teachers in the 50s. I do include a few of those letters in my book, where he really was more welcoming and opening a dialogue between the East and the West. Because, as he said, that the future of yoga in the West would be founded upon the principles laid down in Christianity. Now, when we look here at our yoga studios, I can't see, if that Jung's intuition correctly perceived something or not. It doesn't appear that way. So anyway, I appreciate your observations, Mallory. Thank you.
Do you know anything more about the techniques he's talking about that Loyola practiced?
Do I know anything more? Yeah, Jung did write a little bit in his collected works about that. And William James also wrote about the practices. He was very familiar with them in his essay on the energies of men. So what Jung writes about is the prescribed method. Since he was a saint, I mean, clearly he was canonized by the Catholic Church. So his teachings and method were broadly accepted by the orthodoxy of the Holy See as, the way. I haven't read them yet, Stephen. I'm looking forward to the publication of this new series of lectures that he gave that only a few people have seen, and I haven't seen them myself yet. But what Jung does say in other published writings about Ignatius, Saint Ignatius, is that there was a method of meditation that corresponds in Jung's understanding with the practice of active imagination based on a set of Christian symbols. So Jung never prescribed meditating on Eastern symbols. He strongly advised and recommended us to learn the philosophy. And that's why Heinrich Zimmer was so important to him, because he wrote the book, The Philosophies of India, one of the first books I read at UC Santa Cruz. And I have a chapter 2 on the philosophies of India. That's the way I start the book, because I wanted to be educational about the philosophy of yoga, which Jung really taught us to pay careful attention to. So I'm looking forward to the publication of that new. It's coming out in 2023, is my understanding, maybe in the spring.
What's the name of it?
Well, it'll be the next publication of the ETH lectures, and it will be on the teachings of Saint Ignatius of Loyola, the meditative practices. I'm not sure what the title is yet. It's being published by Herrmann Foundation. Sonu Shamdasani is in charge of that. Yeah.
I was going to ask a question.
I'm sorry, go ahead, Virginia. Go ahead.
Well, in Western thinking, we're monotheistic, right? But the Indians are not. Could that be confusing to a Western person when you have a yoga teacher talking about the oneness of God?
Could that be confusing to
some Western people who are prejudiced in favor of monotheism?
Vivekananda was always interested in the similarities. And I think he did write a great deal about Islam and Christianity, and spoke a lot. Again, these are recordings of his basic teachings. And I think he believed, based on his reading of the world religions, that oneness is a common experience. You see, the opening of Raja Yoga is that all knowledge is based upon experience. Okay, that's 1896. And William James read this. William James's whole psychology of religion is all based on experience, the varieties of religious experience. William James, in the varieties, and I talk about this in my book on James and Jung, used Vivekananda as a target for his pen. It was the idea of oneness that James took on, because James, as a philosopher, as well as being the third president of the American Psychological Association, had his own philosophy, you could say, of pluralism, that he wrote the book, The Pluralistic Universe. So the idea of oneness was problematic to James. That's why he questioned Margaret Noble about it. He was really interested in talking to Vivekananda further, but didn't get an opportunity. I think your question is great because you're seeing that there are unnecessary dualisms between Eastern thinking about the one or the oneness, the one God, and you could say Near Eastern, Middle Eastern, and Western monotheism, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. But they're all talking about the oneness of experience, you see. And what happens with theology is that it gets too much up into the head and not into the body and the heart and experience. So for Vivekananda would be so happy that you're speaking up for the kind of teaching that he did at the Parliament. And let me just say something about women and Vivekananda's view of women. This is a wonderful passage. He said in Chicago, March of 1894, when he was staying at the house of George Hale, "I'm struck dumb with wonderment at seeing the women of America. There are thousands of women here whose minds are pure and white as the snow of this country." And then he said further, "Well, I'm almost at my wit's end to see the women of this country. They are like Lakshmi, the goddess of fortune in beauty, like Sarasvati, the goddess of learning. In virtues, they are the divine mother incarnate, and worshiping them, one verily attains perfection in everything. Great God, are we to be counted among men?" Anyway, he goes on. It's a wonderful little passage where he basically venerates the women of America as goddesses, of incarnations of the oneness of the spirituality he was trying to convey.
Okay, thanks.
Can I?
Yes, not Lori?
Virginia. I think the Western mind, there is only one God, but in Hinduism, it's like those disco balls. There's a lot of different versions because people relate to different versions of it, but it's really just one God. It's just that there are facets of that one God that resonate with certain different people. And so it's not, it's not that we can't get, you can get it if you understand it as it's all one. And it doesn't matter whether it's Muslim or Judaism or Hinduism. It's just that Hinduism has more facets. Does that make sense?
Well, it makes sense, but I mean, how come people get killed because they try to say there's more than one God? I mean, we live in a world where that happens.
Well,
my daughter is Greek Orthodox and she's not allowed to do yoga.
Well, it's just ignorance and fear. Fear is ignorance. Manifests as ignorance, I think.
Well, there are certain rules in different organized religions, and Vivekananda had a lot to say about creeds, and this is where his talks at the Parliament were so stellar, because he really wanted to break down the divisions between creeds and lead us to an understanding that God is in every religion. That's what he said. And he would include the goddess in that. So I think that it's true that monotheistic religions can sometimes be rather dogmatic and patriarchal, because the three monotheisms were and they're changing now, thank goodness, but have been historically very much patriarchal. The last chapter of my book is called The Future of Yoga in the West. So I think that the kinds of dialogues the two of you are having with each other right now are part of that, future of yoga in the West. Will it be based on principles laid down in Christianity, as Jung said, or will there be a marriage, a closer union between East and West, so we don't get into these divisions?
Getting worse.
and this is why I started this morning my talk on vibration, getting in the right vibrations, because we're living in a time of fear with what's going on in our political level of democracy. When I use the term spiritual democracy, I am following Whitman's model of there being an economic level, a political level, and then a third level, which is religious or spiritual. And Whitman did not, Whitman also had a quaternity. He called it the Deus Quadrian, the quaternary God, like Jung, and he included Satan in that. But in his discussions on democracy, he said there were three levels. And I think what is difficult today is we're losing touch with the spiritual level. And I know that there are some here today who, Robert Mitchell, I see, is here today. And he's also written recently about spiritual democracy. So it's good to see another scholar present who has read Whitman. And the other thing, and I want to point this out to Robert, who's listening, is that Swami Vivekananda was reading Walt Whitman in Lahore, India, which was in the Punjab, it is in the Punjab, which, as we all know, is where the partition took place and where, all the bloodshed, where the rivers of blood were just during the partition. So Vivekananda predicted this. He said in 50 years, India would be free, and this happened. He was very prophetic. And he was reading Whitman in 1897 in Lahore, of all places. And it was Whitman who gave him, I think, the insight when he returned to California and spoke at the Vedanta Center here and asked, is Vedanta the future religion? Where he made very clear statements about democracy, that, democracy could have a chance to bring about a unification of these separations in the religions of the world. This is a very beautiful vision he had, but we have to credit Whitman with having inspired him as well.
Alan looks like he's had his hand up for a while.
Hi, thank you. Thank you, Stephen, for a great talk. I'm in Texas.
Mm-hmm.
I convinced our politicians to do participatory budgeting.
Mm-hmm.
And we're currently the largest participatory democratic exercise in the American South. And there's so much spirit for it and so much demand for it that we're taking it outside of San Antonio to other parts of Texas. In the process, we don't have as much experience with this form of participatory budgeting. It comes from Brazil. So we found a state in India. It's called Kerala. And they've been practicing since 2006. No, since actually earlier than that. And so we got in touch with them, and they practice this form of participatory budgeting that is very unique. And in the process of learning from them, we found that this state, it's very matriarchal. For instance, the children assume the name of the mother. So if you're born in Kerala, in this part of India, you wouldn't take the name of your father, for example. And so we discovered all sorts of different things of India. And we've created a partnership between Texas and India to create a metaverse PB, so participatory budgeting, created between institutions in Texas, the Alamo colleges, and institutions in Kerala. Most of my inspiration for kind of lighting the fire a little bit and getting politicians to do this was basically that in the early part of America, people practiced this for hundreds of years in the United States. We practiced town meetings, even hundreds of years before the American independence. And so these practices were due to the distance we have between our I guess, the King of England and America. We needed to get things done, and we needed to decide these things ourselves. So we've had assemblies throughout the history of the United States up until about 100 years ago. I don't know what went wrong then, but I guess what we're doing is applying a Brazilian program in Texas, which is in its spirit very American. And I'd like to ask you for advice on the spiritual democracy you speak of, because we've never looked at it in a spiritual angle. Thank you.
I have to go. Thank you so much. Thanks, both Stevens. Okay.
Thanks for having me.
Take care,
Thanks for
everybody.
your comments. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Well, thank you for those comments, Ellen. It's really good to hear you doing such good work. It reminds me of what Vivekananda taught about karma yoga, which is the yoga of work. It comes right out of the Bhagavad Gita, and it sounds like it's great work you're doing. Well, what could I offer in terms of helping you better understand what Whitman postulated as a hypothesis, you could say, for the future of America. It's interesting that you're bringing participatory in to your work, Alan, and it sounds to me like that in itself has a spiritual dimension to it because it's relational and it's going back to the foundation principles of our American democracy, which come from the Iroquois Federation, the Iroquois Treaty of Peace. We're talking about 1600, early 1600s, when the 5 warring tribes got together and under the leadership of Hiawatha. And the participatory democracy was originally Native American. And when Ben Franklin entered into dialogues with the Iroquois elders, he learned participatory democracy. And he learned also that the women of the tribes were the ones who had the final say in the democratic decision making. that the Iroquois men would take, like your example in Kerala of the goddess figure or the women taking on names of goddess figures. There's something very matriarchal, you could say, about the kind of democratic society, because you see, Whitman was beloved son of his mother who doted on him. He was the favorite son. He said, born and raised by a perfect mother, I now 37 years old in perfect health begin. So he was going to chant the Song of America, but he was coming out of a kind of a deep respect and love for the feminine. We see this in a lot of his Civil War writings. The divine feminine was very much a part of Whitman's spirituality. And so I would, if you're interested in the background, my book, Spiritual Democracy, talks about the Iroquois influences in the early chapter. And there's also Robert Mitchell here, who knows a lot about spiritual democracy. So, I
Thank you. I'll pick up the book. I came for the yoga lecture, but this is great. So, I'm like, I do this on the side on the weekends, which is participatory budgeting, and it gets taken over by women all over the world. It's 11,000 cities doing it. We would be statewide program.
Well, it's good to hear that, because the economic strata of democracy oftentimes gets a bad rap, for not being spiritual enough, and to hear someone like you talking like this is really encouraging, during a time of, uncertainty, economic uncertainty and instability, you could say. And yeah, it's good to know about your work. And in Texas too.
I'll pick up your book. Thank you.
Do we have any other questions? Steve, we're at the half-hour mark, so I don't know how much more material you have to present.
Well, I've got plenty of material, but I want to make sure that people have a chance to say what they want to say, and maybe offer some words of wisdom to the club here.
Jana, you'll need to unmute yourself. There you go.
Hi, I'm Jana. I'm very curious as to where you would put Mysterium Conjunctionis in the level of consciousness.
Mm-hmm. That's a really interesting question, Jana. Yeah, very interesting question. Well, Jung wrote that after his big heart attack in 1944. And as he said, there was an outpouring of new ideas that he had that experience during his visions as he was laying in the hospital bed. And he tells us that he had an experience that I talk about in my book briefly, what I would call samadhi. I mean, he was in a state of transtemporal, as he says, bliss. He doesn't talk about the absolute state. He always stays out of metaphysical speculation in his writing, except for one time with Victor White, when he intentionally said he was going to engage in metaphysics for once, or was it with Martin Buber? Probably, I think it was Martin Buber. But Mysterium Conjunctionis is the mystical marriage. And what the book represents as an alchemical synthesis of all of his writings on alchemy is the final, if you read the final 100 pages, the conjunction. It's really a book written out of his experience of the mystical marriage, which he tells us what it consists of the the marriage of the Lamb, of the Jerusalem decked out, from the 21st chapter of Revelations. He was having that experience on camphor. Doctor was giving him camphor to keep him, in a relaxed state, and he clearly was in a state of mind that we don't read about anywhere else, except for in his writings on Meister Eckhart, where and in his autobiography, where he talks about his experiences of bliss in adolescence. But Jung was not one to talk much about emotion. You see, he was much more interested in the image. And during that experience, it was a pure emotionality, he says. It was beyond the image. He went into that state of oneness, you could say. And he even was looking down at the continent of India from that elevated state 1,000 miles up. I mean, he was clearly out of his body. But I would say that the Mysterium is his great synthesis of everything he said in the Psychology of the Transference about the spiritual marriage. And I'm not sure how much bliss Jung experienced in writing it. He talked about what a burden it was for him to write it. It was a very intellectual work, but it's a great work, and it relates to spiritual democracy in the sense that Whitman talks about marriage. But for Whitman, the marriage was not a heterosexual marriage only. It could be with a man, the lover, the friend, or it could be with the female. So you see a different emphasis in the American classics, in Emily Dickinson, Walt Whitman, and Herman Melville than we do in the European alchemy. There's a different emphasis there. And so anyway, it's a very interesting question. I see you've read Mysterium. It's quite a intellectual tour de force to get through that.
Well, I was wondering, where that related to oneness. I thought you referred to alchemy as a Western yoga.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a great question. Yeah, because the mystical marriage is a very Western motif in mysticism. In Evelyn Underhill's book, we read about it, and on mysticism, it is a state of. He talks about being at the wedding. It's an interesting thing because right after the book was published, Jung's wife died, Emma Jung, and this was 1952, I believe. So he lost. There was the death of Tony, and then the death of Emma, and Jung fell into a depression. I think it lasted for quite a while. But you know what led him to be free again? It was a dream he had about Emma, who came to him in the blue wedding dress that she wore at their wedding.
Yeah.
So there you are. That was the experience that freed him from his depression. So you're onto something there about the wedding. We see it in Emily Dickinson in chapter 21 of Revelations. That was her favorite chapter. It's all about, the mystical marriage, the marriage of the Lamb. So thank you. Yeah. He talks about it in Answer to Job as well. The visions of St. John. But in Mysterium, it really is, and that's where he gets into, talking about synchronicity and the psychophysical background of reality. And he really, by that time, had become the wise old man incarnate. And I don't think he was afraid to identify so much then. He knew he was carrying wisdom. Yeah, thank you for your comment, Jan. Hello, Robert. You have anything you want to add to this?
Well, my mind just keeps going around and around and around with all the stuff you're talking about. It occurred to me to bring this into a kind of a very, very modern context. And I always think of the oneness of the individual that one is seeking inside is what Jimmy Carter used to refer to as the sanctity of the individual. And a democracy, a spiritual democracy, is based on discovering that sanctity of the individual within yourself and seeing it in everybody else. And to me, that is an educational problem. So that's where my work is basically, is in education, K through 12 education. So I feel that there are many things that our educational system could do in order to enhance that. For example, just by teaching mythology. When you teach mythology, you teach the archetypes. And when you teach the archetypes, those are the archetypes of human character. And so that's my focus. But I'm very much into this concept of spiritual democracy, and very appreciative of all of your work, Stephen. I'm still trying having a very difficult time keeping up with your writing. I mean, you come out with one book after the other.
Well, I look forward to reading yours. I know you've got one that works too. All right. Thanks. I'm glad you brought Jimmy Carter in because of his efforts at peacekeeping in the Middle East. I mean, we know that he played a big role in being a peacemaker. And of course, there was some controversy in his presidency, but I think he was a man who really was working along the lines of Vivekananda and Jung.
Yeah.
You know, Jung gave the he wrote a response to UNESCO when he was asked the question from the United Nations in 1947 after the partition. What would you recommend to help the organization UNESCO work at teaching the way to world peace? And Jung wrote that marvelous piece, The Fight with the Shadow. If we all start with ourselves and we work on the problem of evil within us, which is what he went to India to try and understand, which is very interesting when you think about Jung traveling to India. What did Jung want to know? He didn't want to sit at the feet of Sri Aurobindo or the Maharishi. He wanted to have his own experience and find out what India had to teach us about evil. Now, when he was there, he had that wonderful dream about the Holy Grail, that he knew that his work was in the West. But the point about wrestling with the shadow and evil, which Jung was so good at teaching, is really the crucial thing about spiritual democracy. And Whitman, of course, lived this out. He was a nurse during the Civil War. And Vivekananda was suffering terrible prejudice because he was a brown-skinned man and dressed in an unusual way. And so did Paramahansa Yogananda experience a lot of prejudice, Western prejudice. But they're individuals who worked on their shadow problem. Vivekananda really grappled with the shadow problem in India. You know, the infighting between the Brahman societies and Islam. You know, he was very much trying to be a uniter. And as I said, Whitman played a pivotal role in giving him the idea of democracy there. in the Punjab, in Lahore. So, I think Jimmy Carter, I always saw him as a kind of a president of peace, an emissary of peace. At least he tried.
Yeah.
Which I appreciated about him. So thanks for those quotes from his teaching. Yeah. And, the Treaty of Peace, again, spiritual democracy, begins with the Iroquois, and it's the wampum belt of Hiawatha with the white pine tree in the center that was a symbolic symbol. It was a representation for the peace between the warring tribes, you see. It was so much of the spiritual teachings around oneness, you could say, of religion have to do with world peace. The Parliament of World Religions, like the United Nations, is interested in peacekeeping at different levels.
I've thought a lot about what you said in your book about it would have been so much better had Whitman written the story of Hiawatha rather than Longfellow.
Well, the poems were published in the same year, and Jung meditated on the Song of Hiawatha in Symbols of Transformation. His first book on the visions of Miss Miller, who had read Longfellow's poems. So Jung, interestingly, after his third trip to America, his first was in 2009, second in 2010, he met Jane both years. And then he came back in 1912, I learned from a colleague of mine. And then he turns around and writes a study in the transformations of the symbols of the libido, and the Hiawatha myth is at the center of it. You just see how intuitive Jung was at picking up. I don't think he had any idea of the significance of the Hiawatha myth for the foundation principles of democracy, but it's all there. So you see Jung's incredible genius for intuitively picking up things he didn't even realize. And he said some fascinating things too in the essay Mind and Earth about the hero myth in the American psyche being the Native American.
Yeah.
And at the center of the hero archetype in America is the shaman, the medicine man or medicine woman. That's why in my book on Emily Dickinson is the medicine woman for our times, because I think she's really giving us the medicine of spiritual democracy and trying to transmit that to us. So, thanks for your comments.
I think that Hiawatha is actually probably the preeminent American mythology, the American myth, and it hasn't been written as such yet. That's what made me.
It hasn't. Maybe you'll write that for us.
No, I won't. No, not me. But it's out there if somebody else wants to do it.
Stephen, how are we doing for time and everything?
We've got 15 minutes. Francis, you turned your mute off. Did you have a question?
At one point, I was just thinking in this discussion, when we were talking about Jung's caution about Eastern religions.
Yes.
I had the thought that it wasn't, he might have suspected that Americans looking toward the East for religion, yoga or whatever, would be a possibility for skipping the shadow.
Exactly. That's exactly right.
Just forget that and go to enlightenment.
You just nailed it. That's exactly right.
And that's all I wanted to say.
Thank you. I think that was his, and he says that also in his Eteha lectures, that we can't skip the shadow. Exactly. But we have to begin with the shadow and the fight with the shadow.
Well, it's interesting. Many years ago, 40 years ago, I was driving past the Zen Center, And I was in a confusing time of my life. And I looked at the sign to the Green Gulch Zen Center. And I thought, Zen Center, deliverance. That's the answer. And I heard a voice in my head say, no.
Is that right?
Absolutely not. And I trusted the voice. And it wasn't because of anything negative about Zen. I think it was an intuition that it was completely the wrong time for me.
For you.
And I would have done exactly that. I would have tried to skip into enlightenment without any work. That when I look back on
it. I can resonate with that, Francis, having practiced yoga and learned under a Buddhist teacher at Santa Cruz, that I made a conscious choice to let my yoga practice go. And I continued, with my meditations, but included, meditations from St. Francis, for example, the prayer of St. Francis, and other Christian. I wrote my senior thesis on Meister Eckhart. So I've been very steeped in Western spiritual practice since my time at Santa Cruz under Brother Antoninus's mentorship. He was a Dominican, as Stephen pointed out, at the St. Albert's Dominican Priory here in Oakland for 18 years. And being under his mantle as a teaching assistant and bringing him coffee and sitting with him in the office hours, we were in complete silence. I mean, we would sit there and he wouldn't say a word before his meditations. I was living in a kind of monastic atmosphere around Everson, and he would transmit things to me in ways that were inexplicable. So I learned from a great Catholic, teacher, and then expanded from there. I had a little bit of regret that I had let my yoga practice go in, I think it was 2010. So I signed up for a Kripalu yoga course, and I did that for 3 years. And then I just continued to practice yoga on my own as an adjunct to other my work as an analyst, a Jungian analyst, and dream work and active imagination. So I think Jung really gave us a great gift with his teachings on active imagination, and I don't have a problem with Jung's cautions. I found that my reactions to Jung had more to do with my having let my yoga practice go because of my reading of Jung, which was my shadow problem. That we can't project that onto Jung. He admitted he had a personal myth. His myth was, the myth of meaning and the expanding consciousness, and he had a particular way of living in that myth, and being modest enough to admit his own subjective story of individuation, which is what we all do. We have to do.
Yeah,
we're all living in our own myths and our own realities, and so we have to find our own way. I think that's basic Jungian teaching on individuation.
Make our own experiment. Yeah.
Exactly, make our own experiment. Thank you, Francis. Yeah. So, Stephen, do you have anything you want to offer or share? You had quite a bit to say before we started. I wonder if you have anything to add.
Well, I had just one question about, there was a lot of discussion about Jung versus meditation, and I seem to remember reading in the Red Book where, as you mentioned, Jung is using these meditation techniques basically to sort of calm himself down. But he goes on to say, if I was an Easterner or a yoga practitioner, I would do this to the complete obliteration of his ideas. And that does seem to, or the images, or the mind itself. In other words, he felt that the goal of meditation was to completely eliminate the contents of the mind.
And that's where I think Jung may not have understood the big picture of, he had certain texts that he read and chose. My research into Vivekananda's teachings is that he did value dreams, and I have a whole chapter on dreams in yogic practice. And I even have a chapter late in the book on dialoguing with the Rishi within, the ancient Rishi within, which is going outside of the kind of the divisions that Jung made between East and West, that one doesn't really meditate on images of an ancient Rishi, one meditates on images of Moses, or like, in Jung's Red Book, it was Philemon. Philemon was from the New Testament. He was a Gnostic. And then you see before that, it was Elijah came to him with the Anima Salome. These were figures from the Old Testament. Elijah is an Old Testament figure. So you see how Jung's meditations, Jung's active imaginations were very centered on Western religious symbolism. And if you look also at his autobiography, there's the two very interesting dreams he had. Actually, three. One after his heart attack, where he saw a yogi meditating in a church. This was a part of Jung, you see. And then also his dream of the Arab prince after he visited the city of Tunis. He had a dream of an Arab prince who attacked him at a Kasbah, and he wrestled this figure into a moat. It was a fight with the shadow of the self, Jung says, actually, in the narrative. I've written about that dream, and I know Murray Stein really liked that paper. I also have a chapter in here on Jung's dream about Akbar, when he dreamt about, before he wrote Answer to Job, he had this dream that he was with his father in the palace of the great Mughal ruler Akbar, and up above was this higher room that his father had access to, but Jung, the dream ego, could not go up there, and he could not, as one of the club's members mentioned who left, Jung didn't submit. He said he came within a millimeter of touching his head to the floor in the dream, but he couldn't fully submit like his father could in faith. So Jung had a issue with faith. He said, I don't believe, I know. He had to have knowledge, empirical knowledge. Anyway, I'm just pointing out that I do think one can tap into the archetypes of India, with having done sufficient shadow work, as I think Virginia pointed out, or Jana, I think maybe it was Jana, that we've got to do our shadow work, or Francis, first. And then, we're more, the ego is more able to engage with spiritual realities without having the kinds of problems of a younger person might in the hero myth, who might get really inflated. So it's a very interesting subject, this subject of Jung's writings on the East and West. You can find all of his, most of his major essays on Eastern religion in volume 11, Psychology and Religion. And there he also writes a lot about the psychology of the Trinity and psychotherapists or the clergy, these kinds of papers he was writing when he was having dialogues with the Dominican Victor White, who was Brother Antoninus's mentor at St. Albert's, by the way. Yeah, and when he was here in 1955. So anyway, it's been a real kind of it's delight. I really like Club. It's got a good feeling. Good feeling, Stephen. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Stephen. This has been a wonderful afternoon, and you do not disappoint. Thank you.
I agree with that. Thank you very much, Stephen. I really enjoyed that.
Well, thank you. Thank you. It's a different kind of talk than I give. This is my first talk on Vivekananda to a Jungian audience, so it was a pleasure and a positive experience for me, and couldn't be doing it on a more significant date, which Stephen, I think, chose just by coincidence. I don't think you knew at the time, or were maybe recognized the significance of this day when we were talking about organizing it. So.
Yeah, this just happens to be the second Sunday of September, but it's September 11th, which everyone knows, but it was also September the 11th, the anniversary of Vivekananda's talk in front of the Parliament of World Religion. So I'm glad to have that to think of next September 11th instead of towers falling and I can.
Yes, and so many people dying, and
I have a little bit of spiritual ballast to. So, well, I just want to profoundly thank you very much for taking the time to talk to us, and well, thank you.
You're very welcome.
Thank you.
It's always my pleasure. Namaste. Be well, all of you.
Namaste.
Thanks.
Namaste.
Wonderful